Stop right there. Do not read any further unless you're prepared to watch the myth of flawless British nobility crumble into dust. Today we tear the masks off 11 screen icons who, behind the camera, did things so reckless that Hollywood tossed them onto the scrap heap of history with no chance of redemption. You will learn which of these so-called gentlemen drank away blockbuster budgets and which spent years deceiving the government while hiding a rotten core behind a dazzling smile. The most chilling story awaits you at the end. You will see how the greatest genius on the planet was expelled from a country like a common criminal while he was out at sea. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which of these stars deserved their disgraceful finale. The truth will genuinely shock you.
Wilfred Hyde White. When we speak of British chic, the image that rises unfailingly before us is Wilfred Hyde White. He was more than an actor, he was a living export of the United Kingdom, the embodiment of that unflappable composure, those starched colours and impeccable manners that America purchased wholesale, breathless from its own rough-and-ready informality. In 1950s and 60s Hollywood, he was revered. Directors knew that if they needed the definitive gentleman, a man who would maintain icy composure even as the world collapsed around him, they called Wilfred. His portrayal of Colonel Pickering in the iconic My Fair Lady became the pinnacle of that carefully polished mask. He looked like a man whose veins carried not blood, but vintage sherry, and who kept a checkbook in his pocket capable of underwriting the stability of the entire British Empire. Yet, as so often happens in Tinseltown, the glossy cover concealed a hollow interior. Behind the flawless facade of the gentleman lurked a compulsive gambler whose appetite for risk was so consuming that it ultimately turned his life into a tawdry farce with a tragic final act. Wilfred's problem was simple. He inhabited the role of aristocrat so completely that he forgot an actor's salary is not a lord's inheritance. He adored horse racing. The track was not a pastime for him, but an altar on which he laid everything: money, reputation, and eventually his American career. While audiences admired his polished manners on screen, Hyde White was backstage feverishly calculating the losses from yet another sure thing placed on a long shot. His debts multiplied at a ruthless pace. But the decisive blow did not come from bookmakers. It came from the one institution Hollywood fears more than obscurity: the Internal Revenue Service. By the early 1970s, Wilfred's financial house of cards collapsed with a deafening crash. It emerged that the model colonel had underpaid his taxes for years, concealing income and attempting to offset gambling debts at the government's expense. The scandal detonated, shattering his reputation as a man of honor overnight. Hollywood is a place where affairs, drunken brawls, even wrecked sports cars can be forgiven. Two things, however, are never overlooked: financial impropriety and trouble with federal authorities that might cast a shadow over a studio. The moment the IRS fastened its grip on White's throat, the major studios quietly shut their doors. He ceased to be an asset and became a liability. Producers who had showered him with praise the day before suddenly stopped returning his calls. Why tie oneself to an aging Brit with frozen accounts when every cent of his fee would be swallowed by penalties if a less troublesome alternative stood waiting? It was a blacklist in all but name, imposed without fanfare. No formal sentence was pronounced. He was simply no longer hired. Wilfred Hyde White, who had once dined with the kings of the screen, found himself persona non grata in Hollywood. His American earnings evaporated. His deaths did not. The situation grew so dire that the gentleman was forced, in effect, to flee the United States to avoid the prospect of prison. He returned to Britain, only to find the reception no warmer. Good old England has little patience for those who tarnish the British brand abroad. The final years of his life bore little resemblance to his former glory. The man who had sparkled in Oscar-winning masterpieces was reduced to accepting the smallest, most forgettable roles in middling television series and bargain basement sitcoms. He played caricatures of himself, trading the remnants of his once dazzling charm merely to keep the lights on. Hollywood had chewed him up and spat him out, leaving him nearly penniless. His story stands as a ruthless lesson for anyone who believes good manners can substitute for financial discipline. Wilfred Hyde White died without ever reclaiming his place in the top tier, remembered as the man who wagered his Hollywood dream and lost it at the racetrack. He may have believed himself to be Pickering, but to the system he was just another man who never learned to count his money. When the curtain finally fell, it became clear that the gentleman's pockets were empty and that his future had been erased by the cold hand of the taxman.
If you have ever growled a carefree R in your life, imitating a sea rogue, or narrowed one eye while imagining yourself on the deck of the ship beneath a black flag, know this: you were quoting Robert Newton. Single-handedly, he invented Hollywood's pirate standard, gifting the world that rich, rolling West Country accent that became the calling card of Long John Silver and Blackbeard. Newton was a genius of character acting, a performer of such magnetic force that his presence on screen could eclipse even the most decorated stars. But there was one detail that did not fit into Hollywood's production schedule. Robert Newton did not merely play a pirate, he lived like one. His true obsession was not gold, but rum. Or, more precisely, anything containing alcohol that might, for a while, silence the demons inside him. In the Tinseltown of the 1950s, drinking was hardly a sin. Everyone drank, from lighting technicians to studio moguls. But Newton elevated it to biblical proportions, turning his career into a slow-motion shipwreck before the eyes of the world. At first, producers at Disney and other major studios were enchanted by his color and bravado. His Long John Silver in Treasure Island in 1950 became the benchmark actors measured themselves against for decades. But admiration soon curdled into cold dread when they realized that working with Newton was like trying to tame a tornado with a silk ribbon. His binges were legendary and merciless. He might simply fail to appear on set, leaving hundreds of extras and expensive equipment baking under the merciless Californian sun. When they found him in some dubious bar on the outskirts of Los Angeles, he was often deep in character, brandishing an imaginary cutlass and demanding more drink, with no notion of the year or even the film he was supposed to be making. Hollywood is, above all, an assembly line where every minute costs thousands of dollars, and Newton became sand in the gears of that machine. He was too expensive for the studios, not because of his salary, but because of the chaos he carried with him. The turning point came when Lloyd's of London and other major insurers placed a red flag beside his name. In the film business, that is tantamount to a death sentence. If a leading man cannot be insured against production delays, no bank will finance the project and no studio will gamble its budget. Newton became untouchable in the worst possible sense. His name on a casting sheet gave producers a nervous twitch. They tried to cure him. They locked him in hotel rooms under the watch of attendants. They forced him to sign contracts stipulating he would not receive a single cent if he disrupted the schedule. Nothing worked. The thirst was stronger than common sense or ambition. Even when he attempted to keep himself in check, his body, ravaged by years of excess, began to betray him in front of the camera. Trembling hands, memory lapses, and that wandering gaze audiences mistook for brilliant acting when it was often nothing more than the residue of a savage hangover. In the end, Hollywood, which had once carried him on its shoulders, simply struck him from the A-list.
The blockbuster roles stopped coming. He was no longer invited to premieres, and the old drinking companions from the acting crowd began to keep their distance, unwilling to sink alongside him. Newton had to claw for work, accepting shoots in Australia or cheap television productions made for pennies in Britain. He roamed the globe trying to prove he still mattered, but the label of hopeless alcoholic trailed him across oceans. Even his triumphant appearance in Around the World in 80 Days proved a swan song. Producer Michael Todd hired him only on his word of honor and under threat of immediate dismissal at the faintest scent of liquor. Newton made it through the shoot, but the strain of holding himself together broke something inside him. The moment filming ended, he plunged into a spiral from which he would never recover. His death at 50 from a heart attack was as inevitable as it was sorrowful. He did not die as a great actor, but as a man the industry had chosen to forget while he was still alive, so as not to spoil its polished illusion. Hollywood squeezed him out like an infection, replacing him with reliable, unremarkable professionals. Robert Newton left behind little more than the shadow of a pirate's grin and a mountain of empty bottles, a stark reminder that in the city of dreams you are loved as long as you turn a profit, and the moment your addiction begins to devour the budget, you will be cast overboard without a life vest. His exile was quiet but absolute. By the time he died, he was already regarded in Hollywood as a ghost, his time irrevocably sunk to the bottom, along with the talent he never fully spent.
Charles Laughton. When we speak of Charles Laughton, we speak of a man too immense for the lenses of Hollywood cameras, immense in body and even more so in spirit. Laughton did not merely perform roles, he devoured them, crushed them through the mill of his formidable intellect, and released onto the screen something so towering, so unsettling, that audiences forgot to breathe. Yet that very magnitude became his curse in a system that prizes obedience above genius. An Academy Award-winning colossus, his Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame and his Henry VIII set standards few have matched. But behind the scenes, he was a nightmare for anyone who presumed to control him. His ego did not simply fill a room, it displaced directors, producers, and co-stars alike. Laughton was convinced he understood art better than all the studio executives combined, and the most intolerable part was that he was often right. Tinseltown, however, does not forgive those who make its power brokers feel small. His professional arrogance became a slow-acting poison that seeped into every corner of his career. Working with Laughton was less a collaboration than a drawn-out siege. He could argue for hours over a single gesture, a shade of intonation, the angle of light to cross his face. If a director proposed an interpretation that clashed with Charles's grand design, he might simply freeze, stare into the void, and refuse to continue until the set bent to his will. This was no petulant diva tantrum, it was a calculated dismantling of authority. Studio heads began to realize that hiring Laughton meant hiring an unofficial co-director who would undermine the process if displeased. In an industry where time is money and discipline safeguards profit, such a heavyweight became a liability. Producers whispered that the strain of working with this genius outweighed even the most promising box office returns. He acquired the dreaded label, difficult. In Hollywood, that word can be more damning than treason. Gradually, almost imperceptibly to the public, mainstream Hollywood edged Laughton toward the margins. The lucrative offers from major studios thinned. His name appeared less frequently atop casting lists for grand productions, replaced by actors more pliable and compliant. Charles sensed the chill, yet instead of compromising, he sharpened his disdain for commercial cinema. He began to call Hollywood scripts trash fit for fools, burning the last remaining bridges behind him.
In time, he found himself in the absurd position of a generational talent forced to seek his own avenues for expression because the studio system had, in effect, barred him. His exile came without scandalous headlines. It was a quiet disposal of a genius who refused to serve as a cog in the machine. Laughton turned to the theater and to directing, searching for freedom beyond the studio gates. But even there, Hollywood struck back. When he made his sole directorial masterpiece, The Night of the Hunter, a film now hailed as a summit of world cinema, the industry greeted it with indifference and a box office failure. The studios offered little support in promotion. Critics, closely aligned with the establishment, dismantled the film. The reception wounded Laughton so deeply that he never directed again. It was the system's final verdict. Hollywood did not merely withhold roles, it curtailed his evolution as a creator, proving that without its blessing, even brilliance could be cast aside. In his later years, Laughton continued to appear in infrequent but striking roles, yet his standing as a first-tier star had vanished beyond recovery. He remained in memory as an intellectual exile, a man whose mind cut too sharply for the plush comforts of Hollywood mansions. His story is a tragedy of superiority. He was too formidable for the industry, and the industry could not forgive him for it. Instead, it erased him from its future, leaving only reels of celluloid as testimony to what becomes of those who refuse to bow before the golden idol.
James Mason possessed perhaps the most velvety and melancholic voice in the history of world cinema, a voice that could have persuaded the devil himself to repent. Yet fate had its irony. That very perfection became the source of his troubles when he chose to cross the Atlantic. Mason made the one mistake Hollywood never forgives. He arrived in the so-called capital of dreams not as a supplicant, but as a critic with the air of an intellectual snob. Even before his foot touched California sand, he had already antagonized the British film industry by publicly dismissing it as a stagnant swamp. Instead of admiring his audacity, the Americans grew wary. Hollywood adores outsiders who are willing to kiss the hands that feed them. It instinctively rejects those who look at studio bosses as if they were overgrown children. James Mason was exactly that kind of outsider, too intelligent, too candid, and catastrophically incapable of holding his tongue. His exile was not sudden. It was a slow, grinding siege, carefully orchestrated by a system against a man who refused to play by its counterfeit rules. When Mason arrived in Hollywood, he was expected to become the next romantic idol, obediently posing for glossy magazines and drifting from one meaningless party to another. James flatly refused to take part in that carnival of vanity. He ignored dinner invitations from powerful producers, finding their company dull and vulgar. Worse still, he openly criticized the scripts offered to him in the press, calling them paper trash. In those days, a studio boss regarded an actor as property, an expensive thoroughbred not meant to question the stable in which he was kept. Mason behaved instead like a free artist who had wandered into a marketplace and felt no hesitation in pointing out spoiled goods on the shelf. The reaction was swift. His name was quietly added to an unofficial list of difficult elements. It was a kind of silent ban. You were still invited to work, but only for uninspired roles or under contract terms no self-respecting person would sign. A performer of near Oscar caliber suddenly found that the richest and most compelling projects were drifting toward colleagues less gifted but far more pliable. The system sought to break him through isolation. He was saddled with a reputation for being impossible to work with, though on set he was professional to the marrow. The issue was never his craft, it was his stance within the industry. Mason did not hesitate to take studios to court. He defended his right to choose his roles and made no effort to conceal his contempt for the Hays Code and its suffocating censorship.
In response, Hollywood switched to quiet indifference. He was rarely considered for leading roles in major productions, forced instead to spend decades excelling as a character actor in supporting parts. Yes, he shone in Lolita and in A Star is Born, but these were exceptions that proved the rule. Mason had to work twice as hard as any other Briton in America simply to remain afloat and provide for his family, because the studio system effectively barred him from the status of untouchable star. He became a hostage to his own candor. His honesty was labeled arrogance, his independence mistaken for hostility. In the end, James Mason never truly became one of their own. He lived in Hollywood for many years, yet always as an internal exile, regarded with cautious distance. His story is a vivid demonstration of how an industry can nurse a grudge for decades against a man who refuses to join its masquerade. He survived, preserving both his dignity and the respect of his peers, but the price of that clear, uncompromising voice was immense. He lost years that might have been devoted to creating masterpieces had the system not placed obstacles in his path at every turn. Hollywood handed him the bill for his independence, and Mason paid it to the end of his days, remaining a great actor who was never fully allowed to unleash his genius in American cinema because he laughed too openly at the foolishness of those who ruled it. He remained a British lion caged in a Hollywood zoo, denied the right to hunt in the open wild.
Googie Withers belonged to that rare breed of woman Hollywood in the 1940s both craved and quietly feared. In Britain, she was not merely an actress, she was a national treasure, a symbol of refined strength and intelligence that shone in her eyes brighter than any studio spotlight. When American scouts carried her photographs and film reels to Los Angeles, studio executives rubbed their hands in anticipation. They saw in her a new Garbo, a British Dietrich, a pliable figure they could mold into yet another screen goddess for mass consumption. What they failed to grasp was that behind the playful name Googie stood a spine forged from hardened English steel. Withers had no intention of becoming anyone's property or a lifeless mannequin in the hands of costume designers and image consultants. Her collision with Hollywood became a battle between individual will and industrial power. In the short term, the industry prevailed, effectively banning her, but the moral victory belonged to the woman who refused to sell her soul for a star on the Walk of Fame. The trouble began the moment Googie stepped onto a Hollywood soundstage. American producers, accustomed to exerting total control over their protégés, presented her with a list of improvements. She was advised to change her hairstyle, soften her manner of speaking, refine the shape of her nose, and, most insulting of all, adopt a more alluring name that American audiences could easily digest. To each suggestion, Withers responded with a calm, clipped no. She understood perfectly that Hollywood sought to erase her individuality and recast her as a standardized product, polished and packaged for easy sale. But Googie was trained in the classical tradition. To her, acting was an art, not a transaction of flesh and image. When scripts began arriving in which her characters were reduced to cardboard temptresses or vacant companions orbiting male leads, she rejected them one after another. In Tinseltown, such defiance bordered on heresy. A young European actress daring to decline a $1 million production, criticizing scripts blessed by the studio's finest writers? It was perceived as a personal affront to the entire dream factory. Hollywood's machinery of retaliation moved swiftly. In private conversations, she was labeled ungrateful and difficult. Producers who had sworn devotion the week before suddenly became unreachable. A quiet exile took shape. Her name simply vanished from casting lists for major projects. The message was unmistakable. Bend to our standards and play what you are told, or you will not work here again. Withers found herself isolated. She watched other actresses surrender their identities under a surgeon's knife or accept degrading contract terms, and she realized that this gilded cage would suffocate her talent long before it allowed her to flourish. The ban imposed on her was comprehensive. Doors across America were shut in the hope that scarcity and obscurity would drive her back on her knees.
They misjudged her entirely. Instead of pleading for favor, she did something that stunned Hollywood. She turned her back and walked away. Together with her husband, the actor John McCallum, she made a decision that the Hollywood elite considered professional suicide. She moved to Australia. In those days, Hollywood regarded Australia as a cultural wasteland, a destination for careers already beyond repair. Withers transformed that departure into a declaration of independence. She became a reigning presence on the Australian stage and screen, helping to nurture the local industry and embracing roles she could only have dreamed of in California. For a time, the American press attempted to dismiss her as a failure who could not keep pace with Tinseltown. Googie remained indifferent. She kept her face, her principles, and her integrity intact. The Hollywood ban proved not a prison, but a liberation. She demonstrated that life beyond the California hills not only exists, but can be richer and more honest. Withers entered history as the woman who said no to Hollywood and never once regretted it, leaving behind a trail of bewilderment among those who believe everything in this world has its price. Her exile was a deliberate act of self-preservation in an industry where dignity was often the cheapest commodity of all.
Stewart Granger was the kind of man who made women in darkened cinemas hold their breath and men instinctively straighten their backs. Tall, powerfully built, with a piercing gaze and a thick mane of hair that later turned to distinguished silver, he seemed the perfect creation of Hollywood's golden age. He was born for sweeping adventure epics, for the clash of rapiers, sun-bleached colonial helmets, and the rescue of beautiful women from mortal peril. With such presence, one might have assumed he possessed an automatic ticket into the pantheon of eternal stars, where Clark Gable and Cary Grant reigned. But Granger carried a fatal flaw that eclipsed his looks and undeniable talent. Beneath the polished British athlete lived a devil with a volcanic temper and a pathological lack of empathy for anyone he considered beneath him. If Hollywood is a machine lubricated by mutual, even if often counterfeit, respect, then Granger was a crowbar thrust into its gears, methodically splintering the mechanism. His exile became the final chord in a symphony of burned bridges and wounded egos he had been composing throughout his career. Stewart's problem was that he mistook stardom for the right to tyranny. His behavior on set became legendary, not the sort of legend told with pride, but the kind used to frighten young actors into submission. Granger possessed a rare talent for alienating people at record speed. He treated crew members, lighting technicians, makeup artists, assistants, as though they were serfs obliged to anticipate his every whim. He could publicly ridicule a cinematographer's work or derail a complex scene simply because he disliked the tone in which someone addressed him. Directors fared even worse. Granger did not merely debate artistic interpretation, he made it personal, openly questioning the competence of the men in charge. In Hollywood, where producers count every cent, delays caused by the leading man's tantrums are not creative exploration, they are financial hemorrhages. When those losses began climbing into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, the patience of the studio heads snapped. Rumors about the beastly temperament spread through the sound stages like wildfire. First, top-tier directors quietly declined to work with him, claiming their health and sanity were worth more than the box office promise of a Granger film. Then came resistance from his co-stars. Many actresses inserted clauses into their contracts that read, in essence, anyone but Stewart. To find oneself isolated in an industry built on collaboration is the beginning of the end. Blinded by his own arrogance, Granger believed for far too long that his looks and popularity made him indispensable. He failed to grasp that Hollywood is an assembly line, perfectly capable of replacing one component with another, smoother and far less noisy. By the early 1960s, as the appetite for heroic swashbucklers gave way to grittier, more introspective cinema, Stewart discovered that his phone had fallen silent. Offers from major studios like MGM, where he had once reigned, simply stopped arriving. It was a blacklist in its purest, unofficial form. No formal ban, just an erasure from the future.
As he began to age, the situation turned catastrophic. A young and dazzling Granger might have been forgiven a handful of scandals for the sake of profit. An aging, embittered actor was granted no such indulgence. He had burned so many bridges that when he needed support, there was no one left to call upon. His career slid downhill with alarming speed. Forced to leave Hollywood, where there was no longer room for him, he sought work in Europe, appearing in mediocre German westerns and second-rate Italian adventure films. It was a crushing descent for a man who had once shared the screen with Elizabeth Taylor. He spent his later years taking small television roles and parts in films unfit for respectable company, his temperament unchanged. He continued to grumble about talentless youth and foolish producers, never recognizing that the chief architect of his downfall was himself. Hollywood quietly erased his name from the roster of the greats, leaving Stewart Granger as a cautionary tale, proof that even the brightest star can burn out if it scorches instead of warms. His exile was a fitting end for a man who believed the world revolved around his reflection. He died largely forgotten by the very industry he had once scorned, yet without which he could not exist. Hollywood is a business built on the illusion of affection, and Granger shattered that illusion with undisguised contempt for those around him. For that, he received a permanent banishment, a one-way ticket out of a city that never forgives arrogance laid bare.
Terence Stamp was more than an actor. He was the very face of swinging London in the 1960s, the embodiment of audacity, beauty, and that dangerous masculine charisma that made Hollywood studio chiefs tremble with anticipation of profit. His rise was not merely swift, it was vertical. At 24, he received an Academy Award nomination for his very first role in Billy Budd, and the world, including the most hardened power brokers of Tinseltown, seemed to fall at his feet. Stamp possessed the looks of a fallen angel and the talent to move effortlessly between classical drama and bold experimentation. The major studios saw in him the perfect successor to their aging idols, a golden boy who could generate hundreds of millions for decades. They offered him everything: premier contracts, the right to choose directors, even the role of James Bond after Sean Connery stepped away. And at that precise moment, Hollywood encountered something it neither understood nor could control: existential inquiry and intellectual fastidiousness. Terence Stamp proved too complex for the flat landscape of American studio culture, and his decision to step away at the height of his fame felt like a personal insult to the industry. The consequences would linger for decades in the form of a quiet but relentless marginalization. In the eyes of the Hollywood machine, Stamp's great offense was refusing to become a commodity. When the gates to superstardom swung open, he looked inside and saw emptiness, artifice, repetition, an assembly line churning out disposable meaning. While other actors clawed at one another for the chance to play Agent 007, Stamp coolly declined, calling it predictable and dull. He turned down one high-budget script after another, choosing instead to work with European visionaries like Pasolini and Fellini. To Hollywood, this was arrogance disguised as discernment. Studio bosses were accustomed to being treated as gods who bestowed success. Here was a young Brit daring to question the artistic worth of their projects. His independence was read as defiance, and a quiet conspiracy of silence began to form around him. If an actor refused to play by the industry's rules, the industry would simply cease to see him. The true rupture came when Stamp did something that, to California dealmakers, bordered on madness. Instead of fighting for roles or courting publicity, he abandoned it all and left for India. At a time when Hollywood flirted with hippie culture as a marketing ploy, Stamp pursued it sincerely. He lived in ashrams, studied yoga, meditated, and searched for meaning far from the Klieg lights and cocaine-fueled parties of Beverly Hills. To Hollywood, this was desertion. A man into whom so much expectation and so much promotional capital had been invested simply vanished into the haze, leaving producers empty-handed. His absence stretched into years, and during that time, Tinseltown quietly ensured the path back would not be easy. When Stamp, having found inner balance, chose to return to acting, he discovered not only doors but windows firmly shut. His place had been filled by more compliant heartthrobs, and his name in casting offices carried a discreet warning, unreliable. The ban upon him was silent but unyielding. The actor, once destined to rule the screen, found himself offered little more than secondary villains or fleeting appearances, roles unworthy of his range. He was all but erased from the ranks of leading men. Years later, he would re-emerge in popular cinema as General Zod in Superman, a performance both commanding and unforgettable. Yet it was only a shadow of the path he might have traveled. Hollywood was willing to use his austere beauty when it needed a cold, distant antagonist, but it never again invited him into the inner circle of those shaping the future of mainstream cinema. His era as romantic lead and reigning star had been quietly confiscated in retaliation for his spiritual detour. Terence Stamp became a living reminder that in Hollywood one may be a drunk, a scandal magnate, even a bankrupt, but one must never be truly free. The pursuit of truth is more threatening to the system than any vice, because a free actor cannot be manipulated. His exile was punishment for choosing the soul over the career, the ashram over the soundstage. Stamp endured. He remained an icon of style and a master of the unforgettable cameo. Yet his Hollywood story stands as a testament to how an industry can sideline a genius for daring to outgrow its narrow ambitions. He may have chosen to stand apart, but Hollywood ensured that choice became, in the realm of commercial cinema, a final and irrevocable sentence.
Gene Simmons's story in Hollywood is not merely a tale of a stalled career. It is a gothic thriller about power, obsession, and how a single man with limitless resources can turn a radiant star's life into an endless waiting room. Gene arrived in America from Britain crowned as an English rose, delicate in appearance, yet fiercely talented, already having conquered audiences as Ophelia in Laurence Olivier's Hamlet. She was a natural marvel, a face the camera adored with almost mystical devotion. Hollywood studios launched a fierce pursuit to claim her, but fate handed victory to Howard Hughes, eccentric billionaire, aviator, and head of RKO. To Hughes, women were collectibles, no different from rare aircraft, and Gene Simmons became his most coveted prize. He bought out her contract from British producer J. Arthur Rank, effectively acquiring a living person as private property. From that moment began the quiet, suffocating ban that would cost Gene the finest years of her artistic life. Howard Hughes did not merely want Gene to appear in his films, he wanted to possess her entirely. When the actress, strong-willed and deeply devoted to her husband, actor Stewart Granger, rejected the billionaire's personal advances, Hughes was enraged. His revenge was cold and methodical. He decided to freeze her out. At the time, ironclad studio contracts allowed a studio to withhold work from an actor while simultaneously barring them from working elsewhere. Hughes exploited this power to its fullest. He blocked every offer from rival studios eager to cast Gene in their most prestigious productions. William Wyler wanted her for Roman Holiday, the very role that would later transform Audrey Hepburn into a global icon, but Hughes said no. Epic dramas and intimate psychological roles beckoned, yet the billionaire quietly filed those requests away, savoring his control over a star locked in a gilded cage.
It was the most refined form of exile. Remaining at the center of Hollywood, at the height of her beauty and ability, Jean Simmons effectively vanished from the screen. Those years became a season of despair. She watched roles written for her slip past, saw the industry gradually forget her face and replace it with new favorites. Hughes believed isolation and financial strain would break her, that she would come to him seeking mercy. Instead, he forced her into questionable RKO projects carefully chosen to diminish her or bruise her artistic pride. But Jean proved stronger than the man intoxicated by his own authority. She made a decision unprecedented for the era. She sued Howard Hughes. In 1950s Hollywood, taking a studio head to court was tantamount to professional suicide. It was a challenge not merely to one man, but to an entire system built on the unquestioned obedience of its stars. Jean Simmons became the first woman to openly rebel against the servitude of such contracts, demanding the right to work and the freedom to choose her path. The lawsuit was long, exhausting, and mercilessly public. Hughes deployed his press connections to smear her reputation, branding her an ungrateful Briton and a troublemaker. But Jean endured. She won the case, establishing a crucial legal precedent that would later help other actors escape studio captivity. Yet even with victory in court, the industry presented her with its own reckoning. The formal restriction was lifted, but the unspoken ban lingered. Many producers were wary of a woman who had dared to defy Hughes himself. She had to rebuild her standing piece by piece, accepting roles beneath the scale of her talent. She climbed back to prominence with films like Guys and Dolls and Elmer Gantry, but the years spent in Hughes's golden prison were irretrievably lost. Though Hollywood was forced to concede her legal rightness, it never truly forgave her defiance. Jean Simmons remains a symbol of the struggle for actors' rights, yet the price she paid was immense. She might have stood among the greatest actresses of her generation, shoulder to shoulder with Grace Kelly and Vivien Leigh. Instead, she spent her prime battling the shadow of a billionaire. Her exile was not geographic, but professional. She was denied her rightful place on the throne of Hollywood royalty. Jean Simmons proved that even in the city of dreams one can preserve dignity, but for that dignity, Hollywood demands payment in loneliness and endless fight for every inch of screen time. Her story endures as a reminder that beauty in Hollywood is not merely a gift, it is also a dangerous target for those accustomed to buying everything, including human lives.
Rex Harrison perfected the image of the English gentleman to such a ringing brilliance that nothing human seemed to remain behind the polish. He was hailed as the king of drawing-room comedy, and his distinctive half-sung, half-spoken delivery became legendary after the triumph of My Fair Lady. On screen, he embodied the charming, if irascible, Professor Higgins. Off-screen, however, Rex could be so corrosive that his presence on set felt radioactive. His exile from Hollywood was not the result of political intrigue or financial ruin. It was the inevitable outcome of years spent methodically burning every bridge in sight. Harrison possessed a rare talent. He could make himself disliked by everyone, from the most powerful producer to the lowest lighting assistant. In an industry built on collaboration, Rex behaved like a monarch without a kingdom, demanding a reverence the world was no longer willing to grant. His greatest flaw was a perfectionism that curdled into tyranny. He believed with unwavering conviction that only his interpretation of a scene had the right to exist, and woe betide any director who dared disagree. Harrison could halt production on a multi-million-dollar film because the crease in his trousers fell at the wrong angle, or a scene partner exhaled without sufficient aristocratic restraint. His arrogance knew no limits. He mocked colleagues publicly, dismissed them as talentless, and reduced makeup artists to tears with endless complaints. Hollywood tolerated his excesses as long as he delivered Oscars and box office returns.
But by the late 1960s, the landscape was shifting. Cinema was becoming younger, freer, more daring, and Harrison, with his canes and cultivated hauteur, began to resemble an exquisite but hopelessly outdated antique. Producers started asking themselves whether his enormous salary and impossible temperament were worth the results. Increasingly, the answer was no. The final rupture came during the production of Dr. Dolittle. The project became a cautionary tale of how one star's ego can derail an entire studio. Harrison ruled the set like a capricious despot. He clashed with fellow actors, demanded script rewrites tailored to his whims, and erupted over the smallest inconveniences. His behavior sent the budget spiraling and left the shooting schedule in ruins. When the film collapsed at the box office, Hollywood wasted no time assigning blame. Studio executives, long weary of Sexy Rexy and his hauteur, decided they had endured enough. An unspoken ban took effect. Major studios quietly stopped considering him in leading roles. He became a problem actor, a professional whose talent no longer justified the financial losses and frayed nerves that accompanied him. More compliant performers were ushered in to replace him, and Harrison soon realized there was little space left for him in America. He retreated to Britain and to the stage, which he had always claimed as his true home, though in truth it was an escape from a city that had closed its doors. Hollywood stopped calling. Rex, accustomed to adulation, found himself in a vacuum. He continued to play his refined gentleman in the theater, but the big screen was effectively barred to him. His exile was the price he paid for forgetting a simple truth. Film is a collective art, not a one-man showcase for a self-adoring tyrant. He remains in history as a great actor with a corrosive temperament, a man who constructed the wall that separated him from the world of cinema. When he died, Hollywood responded with polite restraint, perhaps relieved that no one would again halt production over the angle of a shadow on the carpet. His ban endured, because even time could not fully soften the bitterness he left behind in those who had the dubious privilege of working beside him.
Laurence Harvey had a face that seemed carved from cold marble, sharp, predatory, unnervingly beautiful. In the early 1960s, he appeared to embody a new golden standard, a British actor of Lithuanian origin who brought to Hollywood a dangerous blend of European noir, seemed to fling every door wide open. He looked destined to become a king of Tinseltown, a man entitled to dictate his own terms. Yet Harvey possessed a fatal gift. He could turn allies into sworn enemies faster than a cameraman could change a reel of film. His exile from Hollywood was not triggered by a single explosive scandal. It was a meticulous, almost surgical self-destruction carried out by a man seemingly incapable of keeping his venomous wit to himself. In an industry where being agreeable is as much a part of the job as memorizing lines, Harvey chose instead to play the public executioner of reputations, and was ultimately sentenced to oblivion for it. Lawrence's greatest mistake was weaving his contempt for colleagues into his public persona. Hollywood has always operated under an unwritten code. You may despise your co-star in private, but in interviews you call them a genius and praise their generous spirit. Harvey had no patience for such rituals. He possessed a razor-sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, which he did not hesitate to aim at the most powerful figures in the business. He cracked vicious jokes about leading actresses, dismissed celebrated directors as uninspired craftsmen, and behaved as though Hollywood owed him gratitude merely for gracing a set with his presence. It was professional suicide. Film production is a business of alliances, and when an entire acting community recoils from you, producers face an impossible equation. They cannot build a cast around a star nobody wants to stand beside. Many prominent actors and actresses quietly inserted clauses into their contracts barring Laurence Harvey from the project. Few wished to endure 14-hour shooting days under the steady fire of his acidic remarks. The situation worsened because Harvey did not merely offend, he did so with flair.
He could derail a society gala by mocking the gowns of studio executives' wives or leak a barbed comment to the press about a colleague's latest failure. Slowly, a vacuum formed around him. Studios that had once offered lucrative contracts began to cool. Producers are pragmatic creatures. Why risk a massive budget on an actor guaranteed to sow discord on set and alienate critics before a film even premieres? His name became shorthand for toxicity. By the mid-1960s, offers from Hollywood dwindled dramatically. Scripts with award potential no longer crossed his desk. Instead, his name surfaced in connection with dubious productions shot outside the United States. It was an unspoken ban. Hollywood did not expel him outright, it simply stopped acknowledging him. Harvey attempted to fight the chill in the only way he knew, with greater provocation, insisting he stood above the petty machinations of the industry. But without the machinery of Hollywood behind him, his career contracted with alarming speed. By 40, a man who should have been at the summit of fame found himself an outcast. He retreated to Europe, appearing in low-budget thrillers and second-rate dramas that barely reached cinemas. Each new role served as a painful reminder of how high he had climbed and how low he had fallen, undone by his inability to be simply human rather than a self-enamored snob. His peers scarcely concealed their schadenfreude. When Harvey died at just 45, there were few in Hollywood who sincerely mourned him. Many breathed easier, one less source of poison in the system. His story stands as a precise lesson in the peril of burning the bridges beneath your own feet. Laurence Harvey was a brilliant actor, yet he forgot that in Hollywood, talent accounts for only half of success. The other half lies in coexistence. His exile was voluntary self-annihilation. He struck his own name from the roll of living legends, choosing the fleeting pleasure of a cutting insult over enduring renown. Tinseltown digested his talent and spat out a cold memory of a man too handsome to be kind and too clever to thrive in a world where sincerity is merely another layer of makeup. He died young, but by then his Hollywood death had long since occurred, sealed in the acidic quotations that lived on in the gossip columns.
Charlie Chaplin. If the previous figures on our list were cast out of Hollywood for drunkenness, foul tempers, or empty bank accounts, the final chapter belongs to a man expelled from paradise for reasons far more sweeping and far more sinister. Charlie Chaplin was not merely a star, he was the foundation upon which Hollywood was built, its first true genius, the creator of the Little Tramp, an image that became a universal language spoken across continents. Yet even the status of a living god of cinema and a fortune counted in millions could not shield him when the icy winds of the witch hunts began to sweep through America. Chaplin's story remains the loudest, most disgraceful, and most unjust ban in the history of the industry, proof that Hollywood is not only a dream factory, but also a ruthless political instrument, capable of devouring its own creator if he refuses to march in step with the prevailing ideology. The world's greatest comedian was recast as its most suspicious outsider with a single bureaucratic stroke. In the eyes of U.S. authorities, Chaplin's transgression was his humanism and his refusal to bend toward the rising tide of right-wing orthodoxy. A British citizen, he had lived in America for 4 decades, earned his fortune there, built studios and provided work for thousands, yet he never changed his passport. For the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, that was the first warning sign. His films, from Modern Times to The Great Dictator, brimmed with compassion for the common man and sharp critiques of both capitalist exploitation and fascist tyranny. During the Second World War, when Chaplin publicly urged the opening of a second front and referred to the Russians as comrades, meaning allies against Hitler, the Bureau began compiling a file on him.
By the early 1950s, it had grown into a 2,000-page catalogue of suspicion, branding him a fellow traveler and morally suspect. Terrified by Senator McCarthy's anti-communist crusade, Hollywood offered no defense. The studios turned away, choosing self-preservation over loyalty to the man who had shaped their very language. The reckoning arrived in 1952 with calculated cruelty. Chaplin sailed to London with his family for the world premiere of his new film, Limelight. Once his ship had left American shores and entered international waters, the U.S. Attorney General announced that Chaplin's re-entry permit had been revoked. He was barred from returning to the country he had called home, informed that he would need to submit to immigration hearings to prove his political loyalty and moral fitness. It was a public humiliation inflicted upon a man who had done more for American culture than his accusers ever would. Rather than subject himself to interrogations and deny principles he did not renounce, Chaplin chose dignity. He sent his wife, Una, back to the United States to settle their affairs and retrieve their belongings. He himself severed ties with America and settled in Switzerland. The ban was absolute. His films were quietly withdrawn from circulation. His name was scrubbed from conversations. The press launched campaigns dissecting his private life. For 20 years, America pretended Charlie Chaplin did not exist. It was an era of enforced amnesia, during which a genius was exiled for refusing to barter his convictions for the comfort of a Beverly Hills estate. The industry that had grown upon his innovations and edits displayed a remarkable capacity to forget, but time has its own verdict. By the early 1970s, it had become obvious that cinema without Chaplin was incomplete, and that the political accusations of the past looked increasingly absurd. In 1972, Hollywood, stirred by belated conscience, or perhaps by the lure of spectacle, invited the 82-year-old exile back to receive an honorary Academy Award. When the frail, silver-haired tramp stepped onto the stage, the audience rose and applauded for 12 unbroken minutes, the longest ovation in the ceremony's history. It was a grand gesture, but it did not erase the past. Chaplin accepted the statuette and returned to Switzerland, leaving Hollywood with nothing more than the echo of his smile. His ban ended in recognition of his greatness, yet it remains a stark reminder that even the loudest laughter can be drowned out by the iron clang of state power. Chaplin outlasted the system by remaining free, but Hollywood forfeited forever the right to call itself home to the greatest of its sons. And so our examination of 11 British legends chewed up and cast aside by Hollywood comes to a close. Each paid a price for talent, for temperament, or for conviction. What do you make of this gallery of shattered destinies?